Okay, morning everyone, and welcome to our second last presentation before we take a bit of a break. A nice winter break, stay home and stay warm. Today my co-host will be presenting. So Prof. Andrea Hurst is a professor of philosophy, and she also holds an NRF SARChl chair in Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa. Her research fuses philosophical inquiry, complexity thinking, and practice-based knowing in the arts. So the chair's overall aim is to investigate how intellectual experimentation and aesthetic practices may undo bounded adversarial identities, reimagine emancipatory social spaces, and promote the kind of dialogue that restores dignity. So in her presentation today, Andrea will be speaking about Nietzsche and the question of humor as a necessary ethical disposition for thinking. So I hand over to you, Andrea. And then I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, you can just post them in the chat. You can either ask your question in the chat or just say, I have a question. And then once Andrea's finished her presentation, she will invite you to speak to them. So take over, Andrea. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. And thanks everyone for joining us. Jenna and I decided that we'll definitely always have to have something up our sleeves in case there's a kind of a gap in our program. So this is one of these tricks up our sleeves presentations. And yes, I hope you will enjoy it. I'm just going to quickly share a screen. There we go, not so quick. Okay, so roughly to kind of place this discussion kind of in the context of what I'm thinking about at the present, it's often said that philosophy contributes to the social good. So transformation, peace building, ethics, by teaching critical thinking. And then there's this debate that goes on about whether critical thinking necessarily entails dispositions, such as curiosity and fairness, open-mindedness, flexibility, honesty, and obviously humor. And I agree with Nietzsche and all of the ancient philosophers that philosophy is much more than just intellectual meaning production, that thinking is this living practice of kind of I don't want to say spiritual, although it is that in a way, development. And you can't neatly dispose of dispositions in this. And I also agree with Nietzsche that laughter is the very way of being philosophical, and that humor turns critical thinking into its more kind of flexible version, which is complexity thinking. So all of this becomes very explicit in Zarathustra, where Nietzsche actually makes at least 159 references to laughter. In this book, though, Zarathustra is presented as a parody of traditional prophets. Traditional prophets traditionally bear wisdom as a kind of a gift from the gods, on whose behalf they act as teachers. Nietzsche actually parodies these prophets by casting Zarathustra as a living model of the overman. And this is really very important, he's playing on a common misunderstanding of overman as this kind of idealistic figure of a higher kind of human being, like a half saint, a half genius. And to make it more complex, this is the misunderstanding that Zarathustra himself perpetuated and now must overcome. So Nietzsche's prophet eternally struggles along this kind of rocky path of self-overcoming, and he's beset with error and hesitation and resistance and revulsion and self-pity and illness, alongside laughter and song and dance and kind of joyous new insights. So Zarathustra is an overman only because he finally rejects the ideal of an overman and kind of embraces what Nietzsche calls the eternal recurrence of life as it imperfectly is. So I'd actually love to trace out in detail the whole narrative of Zarathustra's kind of rocky path to self-overcoming, alighting on all of the 159 references to laughter in the book. It's a thrilling, even an ecstatic read. But of course, this is going to be impossible in this really short session. So I'm just going to highlight some of the moments in the book where humor is especially prominent. So I want to start with Zarathustra's backstory. It kind of begins in the context of Nietzsche's characterization of the spirit of revenge as an insistence on the equality of all souls. But remember, equality is understood as kind of sameness and equilibrium. He takes this as an expression of what he calls the will to power. From fear of not being equal enough, people impose sameness, kind of artificial orderliness on life, to boost their power to dominate and control. Also vengeance, retribution, punishment, all of those things aim to restore equilibrium. So Nietzsche, the collective laughter of those who are the same is kind of double. It's a laughter that binds a group together, maintaining a kind of virtuous, pacifying cheerfulness, contentment, and self-satisfaction. But it's also mockery that protects a group from the transgressive other by taking revenge on differences through a process of dehumanizing ridicule. So we can imagine Zarathustra as a young man. He would become aware of the petty power lusts that motivate the spirit of revenge. And in his disgust, he becomes this great despiser, bitterly kind of mocking humanity for its frailties. Despisers are reflective. They see values that humans lack and desire them for humanity, but they stay too close to the garbage, kind of egotistically preying on it. So Zarathustra explains that kind of contempt for humanity as egotistical. And the one thing he says, which I love, is that there's no redemption for one who suffers so from himself. You get over yourself through self-mockery. I think we've been chatting about that in the session before this with Lydia Amir. So you get over yourself through self-mockery. Nietzsche describes the self-mockery as a kind of Janus-faced laughter. It's a kind of bitter, backward-looking mockery of your own naivety and stupidity and vanity. And that's a kind of self-destructive resentment. You see yourself in negative terms, kind of lacking your potential perfection. But this bitterness, he says, means that you see your potential for self-overcoming, since you tend to resent your flaws only really if you believe they can be mended. So bitter self-mockery is kind of conjoined with this forward-looking, surprised delight at your new talents and insights. You experience this kind of affirmative laughter that still mocks your foolishness, but from the joyful position of knowing that you've overcome it, that you've superseded it. Okay, so your originary kind of know to what you are, which is implied in this double-sided self-mockery, paradoxically powers a kind of a learning curve through which Zarathustra actually overcomes the spirit of revenge. It's paradoxical because Zarathustra realizes that self-mocking laughter itself doesn't escape the spirit of revenge, because in both senses it kind of holds on to a longing in a way to shame and inspire the human monster to become the overman. So he becomes slightly weary of this notion of self-mockery and ready in a way to kind of burn himself in his own flame and carry his ashes to the mountain. These are his words. He spends 10 years in isolation, just like a prophet, teaching himself that not by wrath does one kill, but by laughing. This aphorism is really so important to Nietzsche that he repeats it later during the Ass Festival, which Zarathustra wants to be memorialized by. So during his 10 years in isolation, we can assume that Zarathustra teaches himself the basics of laughter. And that is going to be what he calls camel, lion, and child laughter. So let's have a look at those. This spirit of gravity, another of Nietzsche's famous kind of terms, it's the conventional insistence that life is a kind of depressing and serious burden. That's one of Zarathustra's devils. The camel laughter that kills the spirit of gravity, though, is not mockery. It's a strengthening laughter that develops courage to make light of the heavy. Nietzsche distinguishes camel laughter from the ambiguous everyday response to the spirit of gravity, though. So we're generally more impressed with deep suffering than the light-hearted. But in spite of that, we fear suffering's burdens. So we make a virtue of kind of chin-up cheerfulness, like 10 cheery laughs per day. One ought to be dutifully laughing, cheerful. And this dutiful cheerfulness in the face of life's burdens implicitly pays homage to the priority of seriousness. So if you were to have a more disruptive, lively, possible spiteful even lightheartedness, if that were to compete for priority, then it's feared as a kind of threat to life's underlying gravity, life's underlying seriousness. So camel laughter resists the fear of suffering, kind of underpinning dutiful cheerfulness by seeking out the burdensome, making light of it, taking it on. So Nietzsche will say, courage wants to laugh and rejoice in its strength. But those who are strong and reverent kind of kneel like camels, taking on burdens imposed by external masters. And in doing this, they alienate themselves from their own values, and life becomes an unbearable desert. I'm sure we've felt that, where you feel that you have all these responsibilities and tasks, and you alienate from those, you alienate yourself from yourself. So part of camel laughter is to kind of build up a heroic will that can choose what burdens to bear and dismiss what is not worth suffering. Hard task. And this kind of courage motivates for Nietzsche the nihilistic kind of lion laughter that preys on the compulsions and the rules and the necessities of traditional wisdom, kind of laughs off old values of gloomy wise men and saints and poets and redeemers who kind of unthinkingly perpetuate rigid binary values in all domains. Sort of virtue, vice, purpose, chance, order, disorder. That's what lion laughter for Nietzsche laughs off. It claims a right to new values. So lion laughter develops the first condition for the creation of new values, which is freedom of thought. And then for Nietzsche, the lion spirit must evolve into a kind of creative child. In Zarathustra's words, the child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a wheel rolling out of itself, a first moment, a sacred yes saying. So for Zarathustra, the creative energy for this new beginning emerges when we forget the humanly invented God phantoms that we've made up, and we recognize that God is dead, along with the self-loathing and the body hatred and the world hatred that these God phantoms generally entail. This creative child spirit for him generates a kind of a new immanent and materialist beginning. So it's a joyful affirmation of bodily and worldly life and the self as a creator. Okay, to sum up, these three shades of laughter slay the spirit of gravity, teach knowledge to smile, and pronounce laughter holy, respectively. And I would take them each to represent laughter that makes light of, or laughs off, or finds joy. And together they kind of structure for Nietzsche the ethical development of the spirits, focusing on its emotional, its intellectual, and its creative aspects. And generally, overall for him, the ethical development of the human spirit involves overcoming the spirit of revenge and learning to laugh well. Okay, so that's what he learns up in the mountains, according to Nietzsche. But after about 10 years of isolation, Zarathustra feels that individual self-overcoming is incomplete. And addressing the sun, he basically asks, well, what would your happiness be if you had not those for whom you shine? So he descends from his mountain cave full of this desire to bring humankind the gift of wisdom. Okay, but he's not a perfect prophet. He is flawed by a fundamental error. And this comes out when he encounters an old saint on the way down from the mountain who warns him against this desire. He counters that, he kind of resists the saint's warning, and he counters that he loves humankind. So he actually wants to come down and educate us, teach us. But like the other prophets at this point, his mistake is to love a higher ideal. He loves the overman. And the gift he offers is to prophesy and precipitate an evolutionary leap where humanity is mended and all humans become overmen. So Nietzsche basically thinks we have already paid a pretty cruel price in violent suffering for this belief that we can correct life and mend humanity. And the whole point of the book is to undo this fundamental philosophical error. So Nietzsche is going to make Zarathustra suffer through the traumatic errors and some of the joys of kind of filial and erotic encounters with imperfect humans. And in these encounters, what happens is that he relearns what it means to laugh by trying to teach. But his first misguided attempt to engage with humans in the form of preaching about the overman. He does this, he preaches about the overman to a crowd. So reaching town and sort of finding a crowd assembled in anticipation of a tightrope performance, he announces, "I teach you the overman." And this is an ideal human against which current humanity is a kind of a laughing stock or painful embarrassment. And in response to the crowd's derisive laughter, he sees the start of the tightrope performance as an opportunity to kind of enliven his discourse with a gripping image. So he says, humankind is a rope fastened between animal and overman, a rope above an abyss. Now, I don't know if many of you have studied first year philosophy and you hear this being trotted out over and over as something that Nietzsche believes. It's a parody. He's actually mocking Zarathustra. So when Zarathustra starts with this image, he says humans can be loved for their self-contempt. This indicates a longing for that other shore. But Zarathustra's image is similarly met with kind of derisive laughter. So he again changes tack. He's thinking, well, they hate to hear the word contempt applied to them, so I'll address their pride instead. So he says, we risk the devolution into the last human being, and humans must embrace the overman as an ideal. But the crowd's kind of yelling and merriment now becomes quite sinister. And he's thinking, they look at me and they laugh, and in laughing, they hate me too. There's ice in their laughter. So at this point, the tightrope performance actually begins, but as the performer advances along the rope, he's chased by a dangerous jester, perhaps a demon, who kind of loudly eggs him on with insults, and finally, failing to hurry him along, lets out this devilish yell as he kind of leaps over him. And then losing his balance, the human performer kind of plunges to his death. So the scene of this performance, it's a little kind of scenario, like almost a little play that Zarathustra is forced to watch. And in it, it's the mirror in which he sees himself. He is like that dangerous jester who chases humanity along the tightrope. And in this, Zarathustra kind of recognizes his lethal kind of idealism. Like, I want to go to my goal over the hesitating and dawdling, I shall leap, he thinks. And he's resigned to kind of human death in consequence. He's saying, thus let my going be their going under. And yet, foreshadowing the learning curve to come, he also asks, okay, if someday my wisdom abandons me and then, how it loves to fly away, may my pride then fly away with my folly. So in the book's prologue, Nietzsche sets up this wildly ideological Zarathustra as a target of justifiable ridicule. But there are different spirits of mockery at play here. Sometimes community ridicule can be a kind of humbling mockery that corrects the inelasticity of a kind of a zealot. But what Zarathustra encounters here is herd laughter. It's completely subject to the spirit of revenge. It's a kind of ridicule that is itself rigid. It emerges from a kind of adherence to the comforts of social sameness and violent suspicion of difference. It humiliates people to regain power and control. So Zarathustra is going to have to learn to mock his own vision when life teaches him the lesson of eternal return. But since this is also a kind of a lesson in how to laugh well, his mockery, his self-mockery, will have a very different spirit. So actually, eternal return is Nietzsche's bottom line. It makes most sense as a kind of ethical litmus test, which asks people to consider how their ethical spirit, how their emotional, intellectual, and creative being would respond were they to imagine that there will be nothing new in life. Just the eternal recurrence in the same sequence of every detail of your life, big and small. This is a pretty difficult idea to swallow. Zarathustra, like most of us, finds it sickening, and we resist it. We cling to the idea that we do have the power to mend humanity, to make life better. But instead, what Nietzsche is going to make Zarathustra learn is a truly kind of joyful, humorous love for humankind and affirmation of all that life is without requiring its improvement. Okay, so far we have barely opened the book. And in the time that is left, I can't detail this intricate narrative of Zarathustra's learning curve. In outline, I've just diagrammed it. I think it forms a kind of an upward spiral, and in each turn shifts the terrain of the teacher-learner power dynamics. And in each turn, he also revisits camel, lion, and child laughter at increasingly more advanced kind of levels of insight. So roughly, for instance, in that first turn, he wanders the hills surrounding the town, seeking kind of willing companions now, rather than a mass ear. He still hopes to convince believers and disciples through sermons and parables and metaphors. He's avoiding crowds, but he still wants followers. And he becomes what he calls the kind of fire hound that he later also learns to mock. It's a fire-breathing revolutionary spirit who kind of cries wrath and shame, hoping to provoke self-contempt in others that will kind of precipitate the great event of human overcoming. So he's still misguided about what it is that he's hoping for humans. So in his own description, this firehound is full of loud rhetoric. It thinks it speaks profoundly from the belly of things. It brings mud to the boil in a kind of revolutionary overthrow that eliminates those who falter. And like the marketplace flies, the so-called great men, it egotistically competes to be the most important animal on earth. And Zarathustra's will to power is kind of intensified by a loving desire to inspire all humanity to mend itself. So again, it's backward looking, forward looking. He's saying, my wild longing, born in the mountains, kind of cried and laughed out of me. It swept me off my feet and carried me away in the midst of my laughter. but actually to reach the golden laughter, which renounces the will to power, he's going to have to detach from this egotism of the giver. He'll have to reach the point where the gift of wisdom is offered kind of joyously to all, like the sun, without desire for recognition or the will to impose it through teaching. So the vicissitudes of his encounters with human companions is a really long and complex path. But overall, what happens is it kind of ups the stakes of his animal laughters. So through this journey, Zarathustra's rudimentary camel laughter affirmed the strength of the ascetic kind of resistance to self-indulgence. So it needed that strength to bear burdens kind of lightly, refusing to take suffering to be more real, significant, truthful, or valuable than lightheartedness. And it needed the courage to accept that in consequence, an ethical abyss replaces the solid ground to which gravity attaches a person. But it now becomes kind of unnecessary to unlearn this kind of hero's will and begin to demand a kind of elevating enjoyment from life. And this enjoyment is important. As Zarathustra remarks, if we learn to enjoy ourselves better, then we forget best how to hurt others. So the principle of kind of advancement in camel laughter is from dark, heavy solemnness that gives you the strength to bear burdens, through reflective distance, through choice about the burdens you will bear, to the demand for enjoyment, and then on to a kind of embrace of emotional complexity. Because the paradox in camel laughter is that embracing heaviness produces lightness, resulting in what Zarathustra is striving for, a kind of light-hearted weightlessness where life is no longer experienced as burdensome. And that prepares a way for a kind of a more advanced lion spirit, which develops the condition for creativity, which is freedom of thinking. So Zarathustra wants, a happy, not happy, hungry, violent, lonely, godless person. That's the lion will in yourself. You want to be free from the kind of this happiness of a servant, redeemed from gods, fearless and fearsome, great and lonely, okay, and truthful. So the what he calls the lion's kind of final overreaching and kind of cheeky mischief is that which makes knowledge smile. You kind of, as a lion laugher, you mock traditional scholarship. And traditional scholarship is a kind of scholarship that approaches knowledge, Nietzsche says, as if cracking nuts, or a matter of clever threading and knotting and weaving, or seeing to the proper winding of good clockworks. So lion laughter breaks these bonds created by the spider web of reason, breaks bonds of purpose, prediction, control, analytical separation, dialectics of yes and no, being or nothingness, truth or falsity. Lion laughter at its most advanced embraces intellectual complexity, finding kind of truth where one reaches paradox. But achieving child laughter requires really the hardest work. Nietzsche can't overemphasize the kind of radicality of the transformation imposed by the thought of eternal recurrence. It mocks the pretentious ideal of the overman as humanity's goal, and it mocks Zarathustra's egotistical self-conception as its prophet. Nietzsche confesses that the most profound objection against the eternal recurrence, he says, my truly abyssal thought is always mother and sister. You have to know his background to realize why that is amusing. But he describes his mother and his sister as his profoundest opposite, using phrases like unspeakable horror and poisonous vermin. So he's overcome with suffocating disgust for this reality. And in his, what shall we say, his alter ego, Zarathustra, he wonders, how could I bear to be human if mankind were not also kind of a creator and a solver of riddles, a kind of redeemer of accident. But he comes to see that the will to mend what life has created is actually a form of revenge against life. You know, any redeemer in whatever form, whether you're punting a theodicy or revolutionary progress or justice in the afterlife, whatever it is, whenever you think you can redeem life, you end up doing harm to life. You blame it as the miserable fall from grace, the grim period of trial and suffering. We've all heard that discourse in the fall and, you know, suffering and ending up in heaven. So for him, instead, if the creating spirit desires to become this joy-bringing child, it must affirm and integrate the eternal necessity of reality's kind of grisly accidents, including Nietzsche's mother and sister. And that must be affirmed and integrated as part of life's truth. So if all that is nauseating cannot but return, the ethical question is kind of fundamentally reshaped. You know, you're not anymore asking how one may reach an ideal, but how do you avoid succumbing to despair? In other words, the ethical question now becomes, how do I learn to laugh well? So to emphasize the difficulty of the task this imposes, Nietzsche twice portrays this choking dread evoked by the thought of the eternal return of life's imperfections. In this dreadful image of a person kind of writhing and choking and twisting, kind of distorted face, with this thick black snake hanging from his mouth. This dark monster, which he describes as the utter disgust for humans in view of eternal recurrence, of the meanest, the most wearisome smallness, you know, our petty politicians. This monster, disgust for all of this, crawls into your throat and chokes you. And he knows that to become a transformed, illuminated, laughing being, the only option is to disarm the snake's choking power, not by pulling it out, but by biting down, by, in a sense, incorporating it. So when Zarathustra's passion finally accepts life's blackest flood as a companion rather than an adversary, he kind of observes, okay, I've become a blesser and a yes-sayer, and for this I've wrestled long. So on reaching this kind of ethical complexity, Zarathustra's kind of child joy hovers between laughter and tears. And it's a reminder that the dance of life is this perpetual cycling between weeping tragedy and laughing comedy. So finally able to become the child that he is, Zarathustra remarks, well, rather than being a teacher of the overman, I am now the teacher of eternal recurrence. That's my destiny. So for Nietzsche, the will to power, even as self-ridicule, that elevated combination of self-mockery and delight that leads to self-overcoming, even that must ultimately be overcome in the name of this kind of golden laughter that emerges when you accept the thought of the eternal return. So interestingly, I mean, Nietzsche doesn't just announce right at the beginning of the book as a kind of philosophical proposition that humanistic idealism, the idea that humanity and life itself is somehow fallen and can and should be mended or perfected. He doesn't just announce this is a misguided and harmful philosophy. Instead, he kind of takes readers through this extremely detailed and intricate struggle along a very rocky path towards this insight. And to make this happen, he needs to employ multiple figures of humor, parody, irony, paradox. And if readers are not tuned in to his use of these figures, the risk of complete misunderstanding is high. So, and I mean, this misunderstanding we find in the kind of the Nazi readings of Nietzsche. So why would Nietzsche take this risk? What would be the value of having a struggle along with Zarathustra through an insight that kind of pulls the carpet out from under his feet? An insight actually generated by one of the essential figures of humor, that kind of unbalancing moment. not sure. Perhaps we can answer this from a psychoanalytic perspective. Only a kind of deeply committed pursuit of a desire for what currently matters most to the brink of its failure produces genuine knowledge that this is not what should matter most. And this is what qualifies you to ridicule it and let it go. So the perspective from which Zarathustra comes to ridicule his thought of the overman as an ideal, having struggled along this path by which he gradually and painfully negates his commitment to it. That perspective differs significantly from the perspective of the small-minded herd who, without having experienced any such struggle, fearfully just mock him as a fool. So by having wholeheartedly pursued a commitment to the idea of the overman to the point of being fit to give it up, Zarathustra is also able to laugh at it well. He can ridicule it well. Okay, so that's it from me. It's a lot, I know, to take in this short time, and there's a lot more to the book, but I hope I've at least maybe given you some sense of the complexity involved when Nietzsche insists that laughter is the very way of being philosophical. Great, thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Yes, I felt like this presentation could go on and on and on because there's so many questions. Every time you mention something, there's so many questions that branch off into, you know, other things I want to ask and other things I want to explain, and it really could go on and on. So I'm going to invite people to ask their questions. I can see that Lydia's busy writing a lot there, so I'm sure she'll have a question by the end of the presentation. I see it's Jason now, and then Andrea will take over with the rest of the questions. Thanks, Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. Jason, hi.
Thanks, Andrea. And first of all, that was a genuinely enlightening reading. I'm not a Nietzsche person, so it's not my, I got real understanding from that reading of yours. So thanks for that. I feel like you should be producing some kind of meta text to sort of assist that at some point, and maybe you do with lectures. But I did have some questions, so I had two thoughts at least that go with this, because the one is this picture of the kind of parody of a sage, well, of a prophet, because that's explicitly the figure of the prophet is what you're pointing to as being mocked here. But I was thinking about it in contrast to sort of African sage philosophy, where there's this less problematized picture. And I say less problematized because what's interesting is in sage philosophy, you have the idea of a person who's recognized for their wisdom. It's a requirement that they be recognized by their community as wise. But what their wisdom is taken to entail is a capacity to critique or creatively reinterpret tradition. And some people who've written about sage philosophy have pointed out that playful, that play with tradition is a hallmark of being a sage. So it interests me that you've described Nietzsche describing Zarathustra as this kind of Ted Kaczynski in isolation sort of figure who comes back and has to be re-educated about his assumptions. And it interests me that I think there's different kind of work being done between those two parallels of what wisdom is, but there's also something significant about the amount of play with people's cultural expectations that goes into the idea of a sage as opposed to a prophet. That was an observation. I don't have more of it than that, but it was the first thing that came to my mind. And then the second one is a question, which is, you've given this really interesting kind of taxonomy of ways we find ourselves laughing, because I thought that was interesting. A lot of the discussion in the seminar series has been talking about sort of shared construction or the strategies or implications of telling jokes. But what's really interesting to me is that you've given this taxonomy of ways we find ourselves laughing at things, and a kind of a deeper sense of that. And it made me think about internet humor, where our experience frequently is as the consumer. We share a meme, or we reshare a meme, or we laugh at something, and we're trying to share with others our experience of a certain kind of laughter. And it interests me that that experience of coming to recognize that some of the ways people engage in online spaces are that braying of the crowd that you described, and there's a lot of discussion about that. But this really interesting thing that I think there's quite a lot there to this frame of us thinking about, well, when is the way I laugh indicating a kind of a deeper engagement with the material, and how many gradations of that are there? And that made me think that there's something to say about what they talk about millennial humor and nihilistic humor, this turn towards much darker kinds of jokes. And it interests me that what you've got there is a really interesting frame for kind of reading that thing that goes on there. That was the rest of the thought, sorry.
Okay,
thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Lots of thoughts there, and it's actually taken from Nietzsche in a way. Admittedly, it is well. It's one of those. It's that parasitic relationship, isn't it, where you kind of impose a reading on somebody, but you have to be able to verify that reading in the text. Even but Nietzsche gives you that frame. I mean, he gives you the camel and the child and the lion to start with, and that is one of the things that is really important, I think, about what he says. He says he thinks he can grade the I can't remember the exact frame that he used, but he can kind of assess the kind of philosophy and the value of the way that you do philosophy by the kind of laughter that you laugh. And I think that that's really interesting. So that was the thought that kind of inspired me to look at what kinds of laughter does he actually talk about, just in Zarathustra. I haven't looked at his other texts, but yeah, that there's a kind of, for him, an ethical obligation to learn how to laugh, and the way that you laugh says an awfully lot about your ethical, spiritual development. And he says, that it actually moves from, it's a metamorphosis in a way, from camel laughter, that kind of laughter that gives you sort of strength, to then make those kind of intellectual kind of overturnings, and then finally to kind of make that kind of ethical affirmation of love that you get from a child. So it kind of it moves on from one to the next. But yes, I can't, to be honest with you, I can't remember if there was a specific actual question in what you were chatting about.
Just that it's really interesting to me that there's a habit with these online, everyone is a critic of everyone else's online humor. And it interests me that people are used to dismissing others' laughter in these shared spaces where we're sharing how we laugh as the braying of crowds, or that protective denial that comes from mockery of others. But it interests me that these other sort of more affirmative things that are more personal projects of character might be what we can recognize in ourselves. And maybe in that slightly darker turn toward more sophisticated dark humor, maybe there's something there to be read. But I don't know what it is, but I'm very interested in your taxonomy, or what you're pointing to in Nietzsche's taxonomy as something there might be something in seeing how we laugh at these things. And I'm yes, grateful for that, being able to apply that.
Okay, great. All right, nice, thank you. Lydia, you're waving, but you'll have to unmute yourself.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Really, it was amazing to hear you and to see all these pictures and photos and making so palatable that richness of laughter in Zarathustra, and actually in showing us how we can use different forms of laughter in becoming who we are. As Nietzsche say, become who you are. So I have looked at Nietzsche's laughter before Zarathustra and after. I have a chapter coming on in a book on laughter and the good life, Montaigne, Nietzsche, Santayana, Bergson, etc. And I'm a Nietzsche scholar. I have a PhD on Nietzsche and Spinoza, according to these redeeming things, you know, philosophy as redemption, you know, Spinoza versus Nietzsche. So the quote maybe you were looking for was, I would grade philosophers according to the rank of the laughter up to the golden laughter. Yeah, the golden laughter that would make you laugh out of the old truth. Yes, out of the old truth. So I don't have much to add, just to much to add to the reading of Zarathustra, just to say that, as you know, for Nietzsche in general, laughter can be divided into destructive and constructive aspects. So with laughter, you can destroy the values of civilization, and you can have also a regenerative laughter, which is quite different, which is the laughter of the child. And these two aspects of laughter are actually tied up with the idea of Dionysus. So Dionysus was, you know, if you look at books of the history of religions, like Gilhus, I think she's a religious scholar of religions, she says that Dionysus was not only the god of wine, but the god of laughter also in ancient Greece. And so you have in ancient Greek this ambivalent attitude towards laughter, which is both very dangerous as destructive, but also regenerative. And Dionysus actually embodies both of them. So from a certain point on, you know that Nietzsche says that he has become a disciple of Dionysus. And then he writes, I think in 1886, I think, I don't remember the exact date, he writes all the prefaces, and he changes much in his writings. He had a fifth book to the gay signs, in which he emphasizes the comedy and the laughter more than the tragedy. So there is a metanoia, there is a change in Nietzsche, and he decides that he's going to take laughter and comedy as his ideal, yes, and follow Heine, he says, and the satire more than Dionysus, the terrible god. So there is a conscious shift and an emphasis on that. And the question is, you know, as Nietzsche finishes after Zarathustra with laughter by saying that all great artists finishes by laughing at his own creation. So your fantastic reading of Zarathustra made me think, first, what can we learn of Nietzsche's self-overcoming through that? Because we know that Nietzsche, immediately at the beginning of his writing in Schopenhauer as educator, said that he's actually describing his own path and projecting it onto culture and reality. So what can we learn of Nietzsche's own path? Reading before and after Zarathustra, maybe Nietzsche's own path is to laugh at his own creation, as he says later on, and then to laugh at the overman, yes, and to understand that it means that he cannot overcome himself, yes. He has actually to choke on his, on that snake, on his mother and his sister, and what does it mean in terms of the quality of his life? Then, what can we learn about our own becoming who we are through Nietzsche's description of what's going on? And third, what can we learn about Nietzsche as a scholar, Nietzsche's writings, yes, and work? So you delivered fantastically for an answer for the third part, but further thoughts can be for us. I don't know if they are legitimate, about Nietzsche as a human being and his own overcoming, and ourselves how can we use laughter in order to become who you are, which, as you noticed, I tried actually to formulate. But thank you very much for the idea that which I wrote, that self-ridicule is self-mockery and delight at the same time. It's important also to say, when you talk about a parody, that Nietzsche chooses laughter and Zarathustra puts laughter as a crown over his head. There is a kind of parody of Christ. And somewhere else, Nietzsche says that if Jesus would have lived longer, he would have found laughter. Yes, I found this quote, and only in Gnosticism do you have a laughing Jesus, actually, not in the rest of the Christian tradition. But this is another talk, why Nietzsche goes to...
Yes. Yeah. Yes, in fact, we'd love to invite that from somebody, that the laughter in Christianity, and when will Jesus laugh? I think it would be a fascinating topic. Yeah, okay, but thank you very much for that. I think there's lots of exciting things to start thinking about. I see that, where are we now? Sorry, I'm kind of like, Glenn, maybe your hand is up, and then we'll, okay.
Hi, Andrea, thank you so much. This was just a wonderful talk. I think it's one of the best I've ever listened to, and you're such an inspiration, and I've learned a lot also, and it's been life-changing. It's made me rethink even my own scholarship and my own life. But I'd like you to take us a bit more into Nietzsche's exposition of this idea that you mentioned about the tightrope between the animal and the overman. And then in the chat, I posed a question also about laughter and reverence and folly, where I'm thinking, for example, when somebody dies, how it's a very, again, somber moment, and you sort of laugh at the joyful moments reflecting back at that person's life, and it is a type of reverence also, but there's also the lived experience where that individual life would have done a lot of animalistic things, a lot of childlike things, things which might seem aloof, and then had these different types of laughter along the way also. So I'm just interested in, why do we not revere the animalistic part of being human? Why is it something to be despised and move away from? And this sort of tightrope which we have to juggle. Does Nietzsche address this? Can you speak towards this? I'm just very fascinated by this tightrope.
Okay, so Glenn, the scenario with the tightrope is actually that whole scene is written by Nietzsche into Zarathustra's prologue. So it's just the very, very, very beginning of the book, and it's almost like a little comedy tragedy play that is showing Zarathustra right at the beginning how fundamentally wrong he is about the philosophy that he's coming down the mountain to teach. So this idea that we are a tightrope between the animal and the ideal overman, that is Zarathustra's error. So he's not, I mean, certainly Nietzsche doesn't want to portray humanity in that way. But Zarathustra comes down the mountain and does portray humanity in that way. And he's going to learn through the rest of the book why that is an error. And it's an error to believe that we are somehow set up on this earth to become something more than we are, something more than our bodily selves, something more than our animality, something beyond that, something, so, and that, how can you say this? This ideology has colored just about every religion, every kind of way of thinking. It's so deeply ingrained in us that somehow there was this there is this humanity that has been broken and fallen and is now suffering to move and progress towards a better, fixed, mended, higher ideal. So that tightrope image is the image of Zarathustra's era. And it's a mirror set up in right at the beginning to say, yeah, this is what you're going to turn over as the book progresses. And then as the book progresses, there's all of these different forms of laughter, these different values of laughter, these different grades of laughter that show us in a way what it means to be human here and now in this body, and this is what we actually need to kind of how can you say it, accept and affirm and love. So I'm not sure if that speaks much to the second part of your question. I kind of like got stuck on the rope thing. And
that's totally fine. I was more interested in the rope. It was just a thought which came up. Thanks so much, Andrea.
Yes. So just bear in mind the function of parody in this and this is what a lot of people read that first section, and that's what they teach to first years, the rope image. And they say, this is what Nietzsche said. But that rope image is, it's a parody. It's a parody of what the prophets think, and it's going to be turned over in the rest of the book. So it's an image to be very wary of. Okay, thanks, man. Okay, let's just go back to the Gary. Do you want to speak to your question?
Hi, Andrea. Yes,
Hi.
I was just interested in this the eternal other. I don't know if that's what it's called.
Eternal return.
The eternal.
The eternal return, or the eternal
yes,
recurrence?
That's right. Yes, and whether he was sort of juxtaposing it against the sort of faith in the external other, this deity, whether you could just speak to, so this God is dead idea. So I understand that he's replacing it with this idea. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so. So once you accept the eternal return of life in all its various aspects, its horrible things as well as its lovely things, but particularly if you bite down and integrate the idea that life in all of its ugliness is what life is. Not, I don't want to say all of its ugliness, that's wrong. It's all of its complex, paradoxical joy and ugliness, ugliness in joy, joy in ugliness, all of that. And that is going to keep returning. Then you don't have the idea that there is some form of other world to which we need to aspire. So the idea that there is a deity out there that's going to save us, or there's some kind of future that's going to be better than this one now, that this reality now needs to somehow be improved and mended, and we're going to move towards a better place. That is all replaced. But once you accept the eternal return, there's no room for a deity of any sort. There's no room for an external deity. You can have an immanent kind of understanding of the infinity of life in itself. So if you're thinking in terms of a complexity framework, it would be that life is a complex system, and immanent to that are moments of infinity, moments of uncertainty, moments of almost I don't know what the word is, godliness, but it's immanent. It's in nature, it's in life, it's in, it's internal, and you don't need this external kind of deity that you have faith in to save you in some way or another. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. No, I mean, so it's this embracing of what it is what it is, basically. You know, it's this, yeah. Okay. No, thank you.
Okay, it's also no, but it's pretty, there isn't a kind of passive acceptance of it is what it is. You can still change things. You can still resist the things that are horrible in a kind of day-to-day concrete situations. It's just that you're not resisting them in the name of some reality out there that's going to make things better. It's an internal kind of walking away from ugliness, or walking away from things that are wrong, without optimism, without pessimism, without hope for some kind of savior, some kind of you know, in the future. That it's here and now that you need to be working towards, you know, instantiating a wonderful, laughing existence, in spite of the fact of, you know, I don't know, PE politicians in your case. You know what I mean? In spite of the fact of, you know, environmental degradation, all of that kind of. And once you learn how to enjoy, as he says, then you stop learning how to hurt. That's why it's an ethical task. Okay, but yeah, okay, thanks. Okay, just have Izu. Are you still here? Oh my gosh, I see we've sort of sorry, run out of time. Izu, do you want to just chat quickly? Okay, maybe I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm obviously starting to enjoy myself. I didn't realize time was flying off. So I have a feeling that we need to pretty much end there and say goodbye. Jenna, there you go. Save me.
Andrea, I'm sure that you're going to have to present at some stage again. On this topic, because it was very interesting and it didn't feel like there was enough time, and I'm sure after Izu's question there would have been more, so maybe keep that in mind for the future. Yeah, so just thank you to everyone, and then next week, if I'm not mistaken, Andrea, we have Dr. Robin Kriegler from Michigan, the University of Michigan, that's going to be speaking to us about humane comedy in South Africa, in particular family meetings. So that should be very interesting. Yes, yes, yes. And then that will be our last session for this first half of the seminar, and then we will pick up again towards the end of July. Yes. Yes. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for joining, and we will see you hopefully next week. Okay. Thanks so much, Andrea. Okay. Bye. Bye.